right, hello again. So today we're going to talk about a theme that we really dabbled on already a little bit, but we're going to go explore a little deeper into it and give some examples of some aspects and how they fit together. So where I want to start our talk today is to talk about an older movie. It was called Zeitgeist, and it was actually a political movie. But what I want to talk about relating to Zeitgeist uh, was the beginning of it. And in the beginning of it, they sort of laid out how the similarities between the story of Osiris and Jesus and Mithra, and the way they framed it was that this, like I said, this is a political movie. The way they framed it, it was Christianity's attempt at controlling people. So they said all the pagan religions that were around at the same time, they took some of their symbology and astrology and they just incorporated Jesus into it. And what I'm going to talk about today is that that is true. But what I'm going to also say is that this is the reality. So, although these things seem like divergent things, they're actually kind of the same. And looking at the picture of Jesus here, I'm not even sure where this is from, but you see the circle and you see the quadrants here, and this will be something we're going to talk about as we go forward. There's a lot of these same themes, and they were right in most of what they said, and they laid out how all these similarities. Um, but the way we're going to compare this is Joseph Campbell's MonoMyth, or the hero's journey. So Joseph Campbell read many different myths from many different cultures. So one's related to Norse tradition, some related to Greek tradition, through Chinese tradition, through Persian tradition, through everything. And what he noticed was there was these themes that kept on repeating themselves through all these stories, especially these epic hero stories that come full circle in them. And these sort of general aspects, and even in movies we have today, we have these aspects, and they're represented in different ways, but they sort of represent themselves in all the stories. So despite the material being always different, so the material representations of an individual from one culture going through different episodes, the themes are consistent. And an example of this would be the story that Zeitgeist told. So Zeitgeist told how perceptually the sun, and it's really interesting that the word sun and sun are so similar and sound the same, homophone, homonym, um, one of the two anyway. But anyway, they represent the sun perceptually dying of the year during winter solstice. So winter solstice is the oldest or the shortest day of the year in around where we celebrate Christmas. And this is where perceptually the sun stops moving in the sky. So there's always this moving of perceptually where it sets and where it rises. But there's a few days in the year where it doesn't seem like it moves. So it's kind of symbolically saying it's dead, and then 3 days later it starts moving the other way. And there is, of course, other ways to explain it. Now that we know this different scientific explanation, it's just perceptually it looks like it doesn't move, but of course it is moving. I mean, in reality, it's actually Earth moving, I guess, in this situation. But that's the way they conceived it, and this is sort of this general story told through this and this sort of death and resurrection. And that's the same thing we're talking about here: transformation, atonement, return. And there's often a resurrection in this story too, in the monomyth, in the hero's journey. And this is the same of the representation in here. And it's interesting, you hear a lot of these colonial stories where when they try to convert them to Christianity or whatever religion they were trying to convert in colonialism, there was usually some aspect that the culture would syncretize to. So, for example, in South America, um, the Virgin Mary was kind of seen as something that they could relate to their own tradition. So they just incorporated that, and they said, well, this is a different representation of the same thing we've already actually worshipped. So it's not that hard bringing in the Virgin Mary into our tradition. because we see these same commonalities. And we're such materialists that we see these things as distinctly different, but they're not really, in my opinion. Another person that saw the same sort of thing is somebody we've talked about quite often is Carl Jung. And Jung is probably best known for these archetypes. So these archetypes, and some of them are opposing one another. So rebel and ruler, and some are sort of complementary. So maybe wizard and sage are kind of are in the same realm of working in concert with one another and handing off to one another. And these archetypes have been a way to understand many other stories as well. So not exactly like Joseph Campbell's MonoMyth we were just talking about, but a little different. And this is another way where we see a lot of similarities. We can see that same sort of. Actually, I should go back to this for a second and just highlight that what's Jung and what Jung was trying to fit things into each other. So we see this is sort of representing sort of the same as clock, right? So 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and then there's sort of this cycle, and there's this significance with the number 12, and probably related a lot to this. So the zodiac, of course, the sun in the center, and then working through each of these sort of different eras. And there's graduated scales, like there's sort of the day, then there's the year, and then you could even precession of the equinoxes all the way through. This is, I think we're now in the age of Aquarius. I'm pretty sure anyway, maybe that's the one coming up. But we can see a lot of these symbols we've talked about before, and all these symbols are going to be really important coming up here. But this is the ones we often connote with. This would be male, and this one would be female, and this one's actually very interesting, related to the Christian tradition here. This one's usually related to Hermes, other than its alchemical representation. So alchemy is usually using these symbols. But the important thing is the sun in the center, and this sort of radiating of 12 different things around it. And this is very old. This is, I think this is a representation of something like 200 AD here. And we can see some of these themes, but there's this sort of central figure. And what's interesting is, yes, it's like a sort of clock. But people also represent Jesus in the same way. So there was the 12 apostles. We can see the square in the center here too. So they're radiating it around him. And then instead of the literal sun, S-U-N, we have the sun in the center here. And we also have the other symbols as well. So we have the rest of the astrological ones on the outside here. And they didn't see these things as so divergent, but since we're such materialists nowadays, we see this as sort of impossible. It can't be two things at once. Another example that I'd like to give from around here, and I'm not even sure this is the man's intent, but Bill Reed, one of my favorite artists, this is one of his sculptures that is in the Vancouver airport, and this is potentially sort of the same kind of thing, because we have what would be the shaman in the center here, and then we have a bunch of characters radiating around him, and there's 12 around him, and not including the bear babies that are with one of the good bears, but we have the opposites again. So usually raven, so this would be raven here, and this would be eagle here. They're usually opposing one another, and then there's good bear and bad bear in here, and again, there's sort of duality of orientation around a central figure. This is going to be part 1 of 2, and this is something that we'll have to, before we get too far into things, as relate this same sort of concept to. So I want you to think of some of these stories that we're talking about. The literal one is sort of like a story, or it's sort of like a film that's sort of playing along. And the difference between these two, a film and a hologram, is there's sort of this succession of pictures that creates a illusion of moving. And like we were saying before when we talked about the a priori, that it might be just an illusion of movement. But the hologram is different. The hologram needs something called parallax, which is when you take a film of and this is a kind of a very crude representation of it, but we take a piece of hologram material. Each little section has the entire image on it. And I want us to keep this in mind as we go forward, is this sort of nested reality where every single part has the entire whole in it. And this is going to make more sense as we go forward. But no matter how small each little aspect of it is, it always represents the larger whole, and they're all related to each other. So this hologram analogy is going to be important coming up here. But for now, just remember that there's sort of difference between these two, and we're still coming along with this technology now. It's really difficult to get all the angles that are required to make something that looks like 3D like this. But you can do kind of a crude version of it, but to really have something that looks authentic, it's very difficult. Basically, we're talking about the same thing we've always been talking about, though. We're talking about the material, and as we've represented through Aristotle all the way through what we talked about up to this point, Aristotle being more concerned about what he's seeing in the world, about understanding and studying things and categorizing them, and this is a sort of modality, the mindset we have in Western tradition today, whereas Plato did it differently. Plato was more considerate of that monomyth, of the things that never changed in all these stories. And part of the issue I think we're having today is there's a lot of people that think there is nothing that is consistent. So everything is just a construct of culture. So everything is, there's no morality in that world. If you logically extend it, there's no, I mean, people want to do the best for each other, but really you're left without any structure to guide you. But if you believe that there's something that's always there, like the monomyth, like these themes, like the archetypes Jung talked about, that keep on representing themselves, then that's consistent. And just as we talked about in different stories, where the wisdom in some of these tales can be applied to today and is eternal, that would be the proof that these sort of aspects, which are always true, are actually there. But remember what I was saying earlier, is that you're always right. Everybody's always right. Everybody you talk to will always be very adamant that they are correct. So that's not really the test. What the test is, and I'm assuming this is a question that's on a lot of people's minds, is how do you know you're on the right track? Is one, you will feel happy. One, you will be a positive mood. One, you will feel miserable. So there's a lot of people that think they're right, yet are miserable about everything, have their whole lives falling apart, but still insist that they're correct. And I think there's a lot of people that probably fit that mold today. So you can be right, or you can be right and happy. And this is the good and the true. Or sorry, the true and the good and the true. In reality, both of them are correct, but only one fits together conclusively and one has consistency. The material is never consistent, but the ideology is. So keep in mind, there's two ways to go with all this situation. But anyway, this is going to be as much as I'm going to talk about today. We'll get into some further explorations with this theme coming up, but hope you enjoyed, and we will talk to you soon. Thank you.